of the disease process there. And none of that history, is surprising if you know this history. And what we're dealing with is another epidemic that is grounded in the very same injuries of inequality. And I think one of the big takeaway messages here is until we fix those, systemic, structural injustices, inequalities, these epidemics are symptoms of that larger problem. And until we fix that larger problem, we're going to keep seeing epidemics like AIDS and like COVID, unfold in the way that they have.
Absolutely. And you touched on something just now. You were talking about activism in different places where activism was practiced. One thing that you talk about a lot in the book is how activism was practiced differently in different parts of the country and abroad. You talk more about the differences between, say, how that activism may have been practiced in the South versus, say, in a place like San Francisco or in a place even like South Africa.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. So one of the things that Faison Dixon Diallo, who's kind of the central figure of the last chapter of the book, points out, and she was somebody who was really deeply involved in the ACT UP campaign in the early 90s to change the CDC's definition of AIDS to include women-specific infections, was that for her as an organizer, as an activist in the South, in Atlanta, the idea of doing the kinds of really dramatic civil disobedience, of trying to get arrested in the way that folks in ACT UP New York did, really didn't kind of make sense to her as a Black woman living in the South. And so, there is a really good example of maybe why the response to AIDS in Black America doesn't look like the response to AIDS from white gay communities, which I think in many ways, that response of gay men's health crisis, of ACT UP New York, that really has been in many ways kind of held up as the yardstick by which everybody else gets measured, even though that doesn't really make sense. And so I think that's where we get some of the narrative that I see as a key feature of kind of how we talk about AIDS in this country and how we talk about racial disparities in AIDS in this country. And it's often through the framework of what Black America has done less well or less effectively or just less in general than that other response. And really it's that the response just looks different. It's not that it's less than, it's really just different because, as you said, that those kinds of activism didn't make sense for some of the folks that I've written about in the book. It doesn't mean that they don't do some of those things. ACT UP Philadelphia is a good example of some of those folks, even though there too, because ACT UP Philadelphia drew in lots of people who were coming out of carceral settings, coming out of drug treatment programs in the late 90s, primarily poor folks of color from Philadelphia's Black community. That changed the kinds of things that the ACT UP Philadelphia could do. But it doesn't mean that they don't also do things like civil disobedience, go into buildings, take up space, make noise and things. We just need to recognize that there are lots of other ways that people have responded to AIDS as well.
And that really touches on another good point you made in the book, something that I was completely unaware of. There were a lot of things I learned about while I was reading your book that I was completely unaware of, even, someone having grown up in the 80s, because, as you say, these are not the stories that were being told. One of the things you talk about is how the teaching of history and the learning of history played a role in the activism. I found that fascinating. Can you talk more about that and just more generally, perhaps, about how you see the teaching and the learning of history as being a form of activism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of the pieces of the story that I found really interesting as well is, and particularly, I think about it through the example of a group called Gay Men of African Descent in New York that was part of a larger movement that we referred to or has been referred to as the Black gay cultural renaissance of the 1980s, 1980s and 1990s. And a key piece of that was really kind of forging what was a new Black gay history, or I should say, there hadn't really been a sense of a Black gay history previously. Even the idea of having gay and lesbian history in this country was really new. And so to carve out from that, you know, the sense that there is a history of Black gay men and women in the US was, you know, really kind of challenging and groundbreaking. And it was, you know, kind of doubly surprising for me to find this so much as a feature of the way that people were thinking about the epidemic. And I think it kind of works in a couple of ways, right? Like you have Black gay cultural producers, filmmakers like Marlon Riggs, writers like Joseph Beam, poets like Essex Hemphill, who are looking at their own oblivion and thinking about where their lives fit into much longer historical legacies of same-sex desiring men, going back to the Yoruba, the Ododi tradition of men who love men in Yoruba culture, clear up through the Harlem Renaissance and Bayard Rustin and James Baldwin, and putting themselves within that timeline. But it's not just about kind of people responding to imminent death. It's also that they were trying to articulate through this kind of forging of a Black gay history, that holistic sense of a Black gay identity as something that could root interventions for Black gay men that would, you know, make the wounded whole in the psyches of men who, you know, had lived their whole lives in a society that is both deeply racist and deeply homophobic. And they were in conversation with, you know, some other voices, particularly within Afrocentric scholarship, as well as, you know, kind of pop culture, Molefi Asante, Frances Cress Welsing, Eddie Murphy, NWA, like, who were saying Blackness and gayness are mutually exclusive. These are two things that do not coexist and cannot coexist. And what GMAD was saying was, yes, they can. And here are all the examples that we can show you of that. All of these people have been really important to our survival, you know, and cannot be erased.
You know, a large part of the history that you write about and that you talk about is visual history. And we don't have the book, you know, right here in front of us now, but when you see some of those pictures, yes,
Yeah.
they're just so striking. And I know you have some stories to tell about the archives and being in the archives and gathering those images. Can you share maybe one or two vignettes with us?
Yeah, this is in many ways a really challenging book to research, but also a really fun book to research. I guess it's my first book, so I have no point of reference for how it normally goes. But, you know, to me, it was both fun and challenging. Because it's still relatively recent history, I did a fair amount of work in unprocessed collections. And I know the librarians and archivists here will kind of know what that means. The historians will know what that means. You know, for everybody else, normally when you go into the archive, you have a nice list of boxes and folders and kind of where things generally are. And that makes it really, really a lot easier and more convenient to go through a collection. But sometimes you don't have that. And sometimes you have, you know, a couple Rubbermaid bins of documents that somebody has dropped off at the archive and nobody has been able to go through yet. And I did a fair amount of work in collections like that, which takes a lot more time, but is really, can be really fun because you have more kind of room for the serendipity of going through something that nobody has really touched. It's, you know, it's like cleaning out an old filing cabinet. So if that appeals to you, then, you know, become a professional historian. But yeah, I did a fair bit of research in those unprocessed collections. You know, but really, I think the most enjoyable and consistently rewarding part of the research process was oral history, was interviewing folks who had been active in the struggle, about their lives, about their work, and really turned up some great and fascinating connections of people's family histories and people's community histories, people who have grown up in all Black communities in the South, whose parents have been active in the civil rights struggle, who had themselves been active in the civil rights or Black power struggles. But I found that anytime I was kind of feeling unsure about the project, that doing those interviews, doing those oral histories really helped ground me in the importance of it. I always came away from those feeling like I had been renewed in my commitment to it. And so I'm just incredibly grateful to the people who took hours of their time to share life stories with me.
And I did have the opportunity to listen to just a snippet of one of the interviews that you did. You're an extraordinary interviewer. Just want to say that as someone who's done.
Can I ask which interview it was?
The nurse that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Rashida was a fantastic narrator, so
Yes.
I can't really take credit for that one, but thank you.
You both were wonderful. So this whole question of the recent past is fascinating to me because your book is a study of the recent past, and it makes me think about how we live and create history as we are studying and documenting it, and how tricky that is. How tricky is it, to write the history of the recent past for you, and how do you approach that task? You talked about that some. Maybe if you could also talk about how that type of history is viewed within the history profession. Is it viewed differently than, say, the history of some long ago time?
I think a little bit. Definitely. This is maybe not so much a response that you get from people in the academy. I definitely have heard the, that's not history. I remember that. I remember that, so it can't be history because I'm not that old. But the first part of your question, what is it like to do research on the recent past? Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
It is. It's great, and it's also pretty daunting. In the same way that when I started interviewing, that was pretty daunting. If you write about, for example, I read earlier this year Douglas Bowen's really good biography of Alaric the Goth, who lived in the last days of the Roman Empire. Alaric's not around. He can't tell Douglas Bowen that he is wrong. But there are a lot of folks who are still around who are in this book. And if I get something wrong, if I've gotten something wrong, I'm sure they'll tell me. And so that makes it a little bit challenging. I hope that having that awareness made me kind of more reflexive and critical as a writer. But it also means that I can talk to people. So a little bit of a double-edged sword. I don't want to say that because I think it's ultimately, very good. But I got some really good advice from somebody who also, works kind of in the same field, who told me, you're going to get some stuff wrong because that's just, part of, it's the nature of the beast. It's part of the process. You'll get some stuff wrong, but having the story be told is so important, and people will respond positively to that. So, yeah.
And I wanted to go back briefly to something that you mentioned earlier, also just, again, tying us into what's going on right now. You talked about COVID and some of the similarities in terms of the disparities. And I thought about this as I was reading the book, and I was thinking about what are some of the lessons maybe that activists of today, people who are being activists in any sort of situation, could learn from some of the people that you write about. What do you think are some of the lessons that we can or should take away from these activists?
I mean, so there's the kind of one lesson I think that I touched on earlier, which is the need to get at the deep systemic and structural roots of these problems. That's, in terms of like telling activists what to do, or, making suggestions to activists, that may be less actionable as advice than some other things. And I think that one of the big takeaways here is the need to listen in a very genuine and deliberate way to the people that you want to reach, or ideally the people, really that you want to be active alongside of. So this is a thing that, folks like Rashida were trying to get across to, for example, the Philadelphia AIDS Task Force back in the mid 80s, the need to listen to the community, either the Black community in general or Black gay men specifically, in terms of what their needs are, what their fears are, what their experiences have been. Because if you don't attend to those things, then you're not going to be able to reach people in the way that you want to. And I have another life concurrent to this one. I'm involved in leadership for the Miami-Dade Democratic Party. I'll just say that. And that's been a really interesting kind of role to be in, as I think about how to do organizing in a place as diverse as Miami-Dade County is, through the lens of the things that I learned and the things that I wrote about in this book. So that's been really interesting, definitely challenging, but I think that's a really important takeaway is, if you go into a community that is not yours, and, where you are a person with more power, thinking that you're going to tell people, what is and what's what, you're going to fail as an organizer. And, that's something that some of the folks in this book had to learn. And it's definitely a lesson that many of the folks in this book tried to get across to people. And, so I think that's an important takeaway too, is really that listening is powerful and necessary. I mean, that's something I feel like that I learned as an oral historian, was that is a really powerful experience, to listen to somebody without talking for hours. That I feel like was very valuable to me as a historian and as a human being. I like to tell my students when I teach oral history that oral history makes you a better person, which is something that I firmly believe. That the experience of being with somebody and listening to them largely without interruption, and kind of being witness to their experience, is really, I do think that changes you. At least it changed me. Maybe it doesn't change everybody. Maybe I had farther to come, but I think kind of broadly, and maybe I hope it doesn't sound trite, but I think that is really important.
It is. And I think you were reading my mind, because I was going to ask you, you spent over 10 years writing this book, right? And I was going to ask you how, I was going to ask you how it changed you, but you've already answered that. So my last question to you is, what is the next book that should be written about African-American activism, or AIDS, HIV activism, or any type of activism?
Yeah, there's lots of work to be done in the field of AIDS history still. And one of the things that I really wanted to be clear about with this book is that, this is a book about the history of African-American responses to HIV and AIDS. It is not the book. So there are stories that are not in this book. This is not exhaustive. I tried to put together a constellation of different approaches, but this does not exhaust the stories by any stretch of the imagination. For example, this book is pretty, doesn't go much into the Midwest. There's a little bit. Nation of Islam is kind of headquartered in Chicago, but that chapter is not really like a Midwestern story in the way that Sister Love is like a group in Atlanta, or Babashi is like in Philadelphia. So understanding that story in the Midwest and the Great Lakes, there's organizing that goes on in St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit, and also understanding a lot better what the story is in the South, because there was organizing that was going on in Mississippi, in Louisiana, in Florida, that we just don't know enough about. And so we really need folks to do, the archival work, the interviewing work, so that we can understand that better. I think understanding kind of, thinking where I am, the relationship between, AIDS in the US South and AIDS in the Caribbean, thinking in a kind of regional framework rather than just a national framework. And I think we need to know a lot more about the history of ACT UP. I know I said that has been so much of what we know, but so much of what we know about ACT UP is really grounded in the story of ACT UP New York. And there were at its peak over 100 ACT UP chapters around the world. There's an ACT UP Paris that has been recently, very active. And so I think understanding the broader story of ACT UP, especially as we think about histories of activism and histories of direct action, really would be valuable. We need histories of Chicano and Latinx AIDS activism, of Native American AIDS activism. I mean, there's so much that is yet to be written and so many stories yet to be told in the field. I really look forward to, what the work that I know some folks are doing, and what I hope that folks will do in the future.
So do we, and thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. We do have several questions, so let's get started on those. We're going to try to get to all of them. I apologize in advance if we can't, but we are certainly going to try. So our first question is, did you find your access to unprocessed collections led you to topics and evidence that an archival scheme might have hidden?
I think very possibly. It's hard to think of, well, I'm gonna take all that back. Yes, because like some of those unprocessed collections, I was doing research in before I really knew what the outline of the book was gonna look like, or what the final structure of the book was gonna look like. So, there are unprocessed collections that I did research in 2011 and came back to in 2018 when I was writing some of the later chapters, and only kind of understood later on how that unprocessed collection was gonna help me out later. I was doing a real kind of salvage approach to the unprocessed collection, like grabbing as much as I could and then figuring it all out later. So just being very maximalist in the way that I approach those ended up being a boon to me later on. So yeah.
Okay. Second question, the topic of this book is fascinating. How would you suggest using it in the training of medical and nursing students? Are there any specific episodes in the book you'd focus on?
For the training of medical and nursing students, I think probably the chapter on Cameron, which is a drug that the Nation of Islam promoted in the US, is the one that deals the most directly with kind of medical racism, the history of, medical exploitation of Black Americans. that's the one that I would kind of go to. But I think what the larger book or the book as a whole points to is really the importance of cultural competence, the importance of cultural relevance in public health messaging and public health programming and in healthcare delivery. So, I think the book in that way can be really, I hope will be really useful for that kind of education and for thinking about unpacking what we mean when we talk about cultural competence, which has, my understanding is that's become pretty de rigueur in health, in medical education, but unpacking kind of all the different things that cultural competency can look like or can mean if we think about cultural competency in terms of, not only race, class, gender, but, region, history of drug use, history of incarceration. Like, there are many ways that something can be more or less culturally competent when we're thinking about public health and medicine. So I hope that's something that people can take away from it, in terms of what is applicable to medicine and nursing.
Absolutely. I was actually at a conference recently where that was all the talk, cultural competence and cultural humility. That's another big term people are using now. Yeah,
another history that I would like to see is, a history of cultural competency as an idea, or something that is valued in, medicine and kind of other arenas as well. I think it's really, part of the story of the United States becoming a more diverse kind of multicultural nation, after 1965 and immigration reform. There's kind of grappling with, what that means. And, I think we could stand to know a lot more about the intellectual history of cultural competency as an idea.
Interesting. Our next question. As a white historian writing about Black history, what were specific decisions or care you took in 1, the interview process, and 2, writing the narrative?
Mm-hmm. In the interview process, I really tried to present myself as someone who would be a kind of faithful steward of the history that of the history that I was collecting and the history that I was writing. And there again, I think it was really important for me to, do a lot of listening and, not a lot of talking, as both an oral historian and as a white person doing Black history. So, in that sense, I tried to bring that into the research process. In terms of the writing process, I tried at every point to kind of step back and think about what my blinders might be in terms of, the unknown unknowns, the things, that I wasn't kind of picking up from sources or things that I wasn't understanding, and tried to, do as much kind of like contextual research as possible to make sure that, I wasn't missing those things. So, I think it's really important as, a white scholar of Black history to be, kind of rigorously self-critical, self-reflexive. You really can't do too much of that. But also, I think something that was really important for me in the way that I think about the project is, for example, with the oral history of the digital archive, is that, there's a key piece of it, because the oral histories are going to be, archived and publicly available. There's a key piece of it that is laying the foundation or providing the sources for other folks to do similar work in the future, so that, this is not just a kind of extractive process where I am going in and pulling out the history and packaging it into a book that I'm going to put out. And obviously that's going to advance my career, but also to, create a set of resources that stand on their own, that can help to promulgate this history in other ways and in ways that, just are, by nature going to be outside of my control, which is, probably as it should be.
Our next question is, to the surprise of many of us who work in the HIV/AIDS space, in 2019, the Trump administration launched a federal initiative to end the HIV epidemic by the year 2030. Were there examples or stories that you heard from your research that pointed to solutions that we might be able to apply to mitigate the impact of HIV within Black communities currently?
I think, again, thinking kind of systemically or thinking structurally, one of the things that groups like ACT UP Philadelphia were fighting, really they were fighting against the privatization of Medicaid locally and statewide in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and then fighting against the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical industry's allies in the U.S. trade policy world, kind of altogether fighting against the neoliberalization of healthcare, both in the United States and worldwide. And so, something that those folks have been kind of consistently pushing for is, a program of national healthcare, which would really do a lot to improve the health of African Americans and everybody else. But thinking about the states that did not expand access to Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, there's southern states with large Black populations that are disenfranchised. So in terms of a structural policy solution that would help a lot of people, that's a big one. The Affordable Care Act made it possible for a lot of people to get treatment that couldn't get it before. And so, taking that further, towards a real, actual national healthcare program, would do a lot. That's not necessarily specific to Black communities, but because Black communities are the least served or among the least served by the current system, that's one that would, I think, really dramatically benefit them. And then of course, the implementation of the delivery of that system has to be, culturally competent and all the rest. But if I could do one thing, that very well may be it.
Our next question is, were the organizations you examined looking at ways to fix the discriminatory lack of access to prevention and healthcare, or were they focused on independently providing alternative options?
Mm-hmm. So kind of like, were they working for change from within or without? And I think the answer is both. You can't really, there are plenty of examples where people are kind of doing both at once, in ways that are pretty necessary. So for example, the Balm and Gilead or Sister Love, both end up working with the CDC in the early 2000s to expand their programs from the United States into countries in sub-Saharan Africa to address the pandemics there. Rashida Hassan, at the time that she formed Babashi, was also the board vice president of Philadelphia Community Health Alternatives, one of the groups that she became very critical of. So, people at different points are kind of doing both, trying to change the system while also kind of building, their own alternatives, but then also trying to, get support for those alternatives, which means, making them kind of intelligible or attractive to foundation funders, to public funders, in ways that become quite complicated for some of them. For a group like Babashi, who got, a couple $100,000 from the CDC in the late 1980s, that ended up being, a kind of double-edged sword for them, because they grew really quickly, and then in a way that was unsustainable and had to declare bankruptcy. So being kind of reliant on those kinds of funding ultimately end up being pretty complicated in a bad way for some of these groups.
Absolutely.
Kind of roundabout answer.
I thought you did a great job in the book of talking about that.
Yeah.
Those funding and structural challenges were so major.
Yeah.
We have another question here. Do you include stories about people who were disappointed or harmed by alternative therapies?
Yeah, so I deal with this primarily in one chapter of the book, which is about the Nation of Islam campaign to promote Kemran, which was they pitched as an African treatment or cure for HIV or for AIDS rather. And yeah, a big part of that story is the fact that it didn't work for many of the people who took it. And but again, on the theme of of listening to people and listening to communities, part of what I'm doing in that part of what I try to do in that chapter is not just to say like, hey, like in the way that others have written about the Kemran story, is not to say like, hey, is this a weird story that these that the Nation of Islam was promoting this drug in Black communities in the United States, but to ask, what is it about the history of those communities and the experiences of, those individual people that made the Nation of Islam pitch for Kemran attractive? And it's the history of medical discrimination and medical exploitation in this country. I mean, there's a really deep rooted and extremely well justified suspicion of, of major medical institutions. So, I do talk about, some of the harm from alternative therapies and the harm that comes from AIDS denialism, because that's real, and we can't discount that. But I think it's also important to understand like what makes those therapies attractive to people in the first place, and it's because of Tuskegee and forced sterilizations, and the fact that that people of color and African Americans in particular who go to the doctor are stereotyped and discriminated against by the people who are supposed to care for them. So yes, I do deal with it, but I've tried to tell that story in a way that is, I hope complex and nuanced, and also makes room for the understanding of why folks acted in the ways that they did.
And we have one last question. Has your research looked at what was happening in Black communities with HIV in the diaspora? For example, Southern Africa or Caribbean as compared to the US?
Yes, although the approach that I take is not so much comparative as it is transnational. So what I mean by that is it's less about comparing, say, the situation in Atlanta to the situation in Johannesburg, South Africa, as it is about the work that groups like Sister Love or the Balm in Gilead or Active Philadelphia were doing to draw connections between those places, or to organize in both spaces, or to take what they had done in one space and translate it into another. So that's very much the story of the Balm in Gilead or Sister Love, who take some of the programs that they developed in the United States and port them into places like Tanzania or South Africa or Cote d'Ivoire, to say like the things that we experience in the United States and Black communities, resonate with what is happening throughout the diaspora. So there is very much a significant theme of diaspora to the stories that I tell in this book. Yeah.
So that is our last question. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion, for being here. We wish you all the best, and so grateful to have you here this evening, and also very grateful to everyone who participated virtually in this as listeners. We really appreciate having you. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Maria.
Thank you, Stacy. Dan, thank you so much for presenting your work, for sharing not just the research that you've carried out, but how you've done it. And the fact that you have created a body of research materials that share a history and make it possible for people's work to be documented and remembered and available for others to be able to carry that research forward. And Stacy, thank you for moderating such a great conversation, so insightful. Really appreciate being in the audience tonight. I also want to thank my libraries and press colleagues. I get to be the face of the Off the Shelf series, but I really rely so much on the help of folks, especially Katie Fanfani with the libraries and Ali Shea with the press, for everything they do to make this series and these events possible. And as Stacy said, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today. Don't forget to visit uncpress.org to use your 40% discount to buy Dan's book. I hope we'll see you at our next Off the Shelf event on Thursday, November 19th at 5:30 p.m. when Tyler D. Parry presents his new book, Jumping the Broom: The Surprising Multicultural Origins of a Black Wedding Ritual, in conversation with Monica Figueroa, the interim librarian for inclusive excellence here at UNC Libraries. So thank you once again, and we'll see you in a month. Dan, thank you. Stacy,
Thanks
bye.
to all of you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks.